I made a pun about the wind, but it blows. What's going on, YouTube? So I have been blessed by the algorithm gods who have told me to answer a specific ESO question based on your guys' searches. So the number one search question for ESO right now, according to Google and the YouTubes, is a solo tier list. What is the best class to play solo? And I thought, I feel like I could answer this question pretty well. Unlike our last class tier list, I'm going to break it down between mag and stamina. Also, too, because this is a little bit different than the one that we did previously, I'm also going to kind of keep in mind both PVE solo content and PvP solo content, because I think a lot of people will just base it off of PVE solo type stuff. But you know, you probably also want to know, like, if I queue for a solo battleground, if I queue, you know, if I want to go into Cyrodiil, get my tier 1 rewards or stuff like that too. I think all of that should be taken into consideration. But things that require, you know, definite group coordination, you know, trials, I'm going to potentially not consider. So for example, if a set required, you know, to be a, let's say 10 out of 10 solo, you know, build requires you to get some perfected trial set, well, not really going to be able to count, because that assumes that you're not then really playing solo. So that's going to be the kind of the criteria that we look at. The important things that we're going to be considering on this tier list are a couple things. Now, the biggest portion of this is a lot of these might require some hybridization. For example, actually the first one here, the Magicka Arcanist, is almost going to certainly require you to still use stamina abilities, and that's going to be potentially a common theme, especially as we talk about like solo PvP content and even some PvE content, depending on what you're looking to do. So that's going to be an important factor. Other important factors are, does your class have specific things, you know, such as executes? Some classes don't. Some classes don't have the ability to make you go faster. You know, some classes are, you know, have a lot of things missing. And that's what we're going to be kind of grading all of those things together, because as a solo player, you can't rely on other people for buffs. You can't rely on other people really for anything. And that's how we're going to kind of look at this, is in a vacuum, solely based on your contributions to yourself. And the first one is the Magicka Arcanist, which I'm going to put in the A tier. Now, I might change these ranks around at the end, just full disclosure. The reason for me that the Magicka Arcanist is only an A tier, because it does have a lot of things that you as a solo player might want. It's got a lot of really good skill trees that are broken down based on what it's trying to do. It's very plug and play, but it does lose a couple points. For example, the best way that you're going to build a Magicka Arcanist, it's going to require you to use the Fate Carver. And that's going to require you to aim. It can be really tedious sometimes to try to channel that bad boy. It does still pair really well with sets, but when it comes to its baby brother, it just does everything better. The Stamina Arcanist is if the Magicka Arcanist had no problems. And that's where I think that these are two very different classes, and that's why I think that they're going to be on different tiers for me. I do think that the Magicka Arcanist is still very plug and playable. It's still great for that solo content. I do also suspect that at some point soon for PvE that we are going to see a nerf for both Arcanists. And I'm not saying that that should be used against them, you know, but what I would say is a lot of people keep rating them exceptionally highly, and we know that, you know, ESO, ZeniMax will look at that and go, you know, maybe we need to change some things around. So just kind of food for thought that there is a decent potential that it does get nerfed, but if I had to break down the Stamina Magicka versions, this is how I would delineate them. Next up, we have Magicka Nightblade, which for me is also going to go into the A tier. I think when you look at something like a Magicka Nightblade, you have something that has a lot of versatility, and you have a lot of ultimate, you have a lot of damage output, which can be really helpful for that solo type content where you're not having to rely on other people, whether it's fighting world bosses, fighting people in PvP. But it's very tedious to master, I think, is where it loses some points. And I always try to do these tier lists based on if I was suggesting this to somebody who was going to go out and be a solo player, because if, for example, you may have had, you know, hundreds of hours of ESO knowledge, and you may have played with tons of groups of people who've given you advice over the years, and you've maybe been able to put something like a Magicka Nightblade into the S tier for you, but that doesn't translate to me suggesting it to somebody who's brand new, who's going to really struggle with its kind of more complicated rotations. It can be much more reliant on, attack canceling, weaving, light attacking. And for those reasons, I'm only going to put it in A tier just because it is a bit more tedious to master than most of the other classes. So for me, that's why it's going to go in the A tier. Its stamina version is so much harder to grade because on one hand, I love its ability to do single target damage. I think it's a little bit easier to master, but it does suffer from save problems as the other Nightblade. It's, brother the Magic of Nightblade. I'm going to put it just below it in the A tier, but as always, I reserve the right to come back and change this. The reason that I'm putting it so highly is that even though it's not as good on paper as its Magicka brethren, the reason why it gets points is because most PvE solo players and PvP solo players, they want to do high single target damage. And this is one of the best classes to do that. Now, it does suffer from the same problem as the Magicka one. It can be very hard to master, be a little more complicated to run, but it does what I think most people want a solo class to do. So that's why I'm going to put it right now, at least, in the A tier. And unfortunately, everything we've talked about so far is going to go against the Magicka Necromancer. Magicka Necromancers have great AoEs. They have really good sustain and the ability to keep themselves alive, but it's unfortunately really about the best things that they can do. And those are some great things when you're doing things more like trial content, dungeon content. But if you're really looking at solo type content, it can be hard to do that. The other thing too is Magicka Necromancers also generally build into stamina, and that can also be a little bit tricky for them when they're trying to have this sense of being different. And that's why a lot of times I don't break them down between Magicka and stamina, because a lot of times there is a lot more hybridization than you might think. But especially for the Magicka one, because of how it specializes, it's going to go in the C tier. It's just bang average and not something that I would generally suggest just because of what its strengths are. Its brother, though, the Stamina Necromancer, is better. I do think it suffers the same problems. The AoEs, the damage is better, so that's good. But it is much more complicated to run. Now, Magicka Necromancers are not exactly easy, but this becomes more tricky. But also, its best things are also its resources, survivability, and AoE, which, depending on the type of content that you do, and I'm taking this with a grain of salt because obviously there's a difference in farming solo arenas versus having to do things like just kill world bosses, as a solo player versus going to battlegrounds as kind of a solo, or open world Citadel or Imperial City as a solo player. I do think that there is definitely a place for AoEs, and I am not discounting its ability to do that. That's why I think it's a B tier thing, but it also is very heavily dependent upon being close to your enemies, which can be rather annoying. So you might want to give it points for its ability to do things like arenas, Bait Strand, Maelstrom, but then you almost want to take points away because of how dependent upon it is being close to those unfortunate mechanics that can sometimes be a little bit more annoying when you don't have options to deal with them at range. So for me, that's why it's going to go in the B tier. This next one does a lot of things well, but not enough to push it to the A tier for me. So I think if you took some of the flaws away from the Stamina Necromancer, but then you made it deal less damage and you gave it a little bit more reliance on things such as pets, you would have yourself the Magicka Warden. I do think its versatility is what bumps it above the Stamina Necromancer, and it's got itself some really good ability to do single target as well as AoE damage, which is definitely going to be helpful. Because for me, at least, the majority of the content that you'll be doing is going to be more single target focused. But because it doesn't shine in any one department, that's for me is why it's going to be in the B tier, which is still a great suggestion. And if you're interested, it's still a great option for you. For PvP, it can also be a little bit tedious to run things like Magicka Wardens. They have a little bit more complex to run. I will say, though, that they're, brethren, the stamina ones, which we'll talk about next. There's a little more plug and play for PvP, but they've also got their own pieces to talk about. And that is the Stamina Warden. Now, I am not generally a fan of the Stamina Warden, but I will give it some credit where it's due. It does have the ability to have a lot of mobility. You have the ability to do decent amounts of AoE as well as single target damage. I would say that the rotation is a much more simplistic, whether it's looking at PvP or PvE type content. It doesn't always have to rely on pets too. I do think that a lot of people do utilize it for pets, but for me, it's just going to be in the B tier, below the Stamina Necromancer. It's a bit of a hot take, I know. Hopefully, you won't be too mean in the comments. This next one is just weird, right? So you've got a class that is basically tailor-made for dots and doing amounts of damage, and it's great for things like trials, 4-man content, and things like that. But it doesn't even have an execute. And, its mobility is also bad, so it's really hard to grade this, but I'm going to put it in the C tier. I look at this as one of those things where it's like, this is a great class for somebody that wants to build into things like trials, because generally, things like damage over time abilities can be great on classes, that are interested in that trial type content. So for me, when you're looking at that as a solo player, you are probably going to struggle in some things that other classes aren't going to struggle with as much. And you also don't have things like executes, high mobility things. You also can sometimes struggle with sustain. And for me, that's why it's going to go down in the C tier for me. And it's something that its brother, the Stamina Dragonknight, suffers from too, but to a lesser degree. So the Stamina Dragonknight version also does a lot of damage in long fights, but the problem is the majority of fights and things that you're going to find yourself in is not going to be super often. You might even think that, oh, what about world bosses and stuff? And that's where the sometimes lack of survivability is going to really start to hurt against you. Obviously, if you're playing solo, you can still have companions. If you're in, solo PvP, you can Imperial City, you can still have a group people that you're with. I think the ability to build in ultimates, the ability to do, high amounts of damage over time is still going to be really good and helpful for you. But I am going to put it in the B tier, which is still a great tier, mind you. This is still a good tier to be in. It is just not something that I think could be any higher, at least, as I kind of talk myself through the pros and the cons of the class. This next one is easy for me, and I struggle on if I like it better than the Stamina Arcanist. I think the Stamina Arcanist is going to stay up top. The only thing that makes me think this could be higher is I think that Magicka Templars are really much better than Stamina Arcanists for things like solo PvP content. And the ability to just easily plug and play with a Templar is just so good. You can do so many things with a Magicka Templar and not have to really worry. You don't have to get any deep, you don't have to watch any 40, 60-minute YouTube videos to try to understand why it is you're doing what you're doing. It's so simplistic, and it's been the most simplistic class to learn. And that's why when anyone is like, I want to get into something that's very versatile, that's also very easy, that can be something that completes all types of content, without necessarily specializing in anything. Most people aren't going to be like, oh, Templars are the best, DPS set, they're the best DPS class, or, the best tanking class. They do sometimes, reach those upper echelons, but they've consistently been, A tier for a lot of times. And when you're looking at something that you want to suggest to people, I definitely put Templars at the top. And also going up in the S tier, I have Stamina Templars. I think that a lot of things the Stamina Templar does is pretty comparable, obviously, to the Magicka one, because they're not exceptionally different, except for a couple things. You are much more focused on the immediate area in front of you when you're a Templar, which can be a little bit more annoying depending on the type of content that you're doing. If you're farming certain arenas, if you're farming certain, different types of solo content, world bosses, it can be really annoying to be kind of hamstrung to this smaller area. It's also not quite as strong with its, rotation as its Magicka brother as well, but it still gets all of the exact same points. Plug and playable, absolutely great. Templars have consistently been a great class to suggest to people, and because of that, it's going up in the S tier. This next one's hard, right? So I put the Death Dealer's Feet Mythic in the B tier because I thought that I was too biased. I was going to grade it too highly. And I have played Magicka Sorcerer for forever. And I am going to do a thing that I don't normally do. And I'm going to go with my heart, which tells me the top of S tier. Why? Because Magicka Sorcerers have everything. they've got mobility, they've got single target damage, they've got pet builds, which can be really good for newer players who are interested in, farming things, with having higher DPS. It's really good for PvP because a lot of the things that you need, it's got the stun, it's got good heals, which a great burst heal in the Twilight Matriarch does make you a bit more pet dependent, but it does pair well with everything else that it does. You can easily go into any type of content with a Magicka Sorcerer and do phenomenally well. It's got everything you could want in the class. And the other thing too that I think that gets slept on is its ability to have high mobility. You can use things, like Lightning Form, you can use things like Streak to get through different types of content faster, and you could still pair that with everything else that it's got in its class arsenal. You don't have to utilize any other weapon skill line, mages line, any other of those guild lines that you don't want to, because everything that you could need is going to be in that class for you, and that's why I love it. And I want to put it at the top of S tier. My heart is telling me top of S tier. This is probably an overcorrection for the time that I made the mistake of not going with my heart and trying to lower it down. So we'll see what the comments say. I will say that its stamina brother is a little bit harder to use, but it still has a lot of those same positives of everything else in this line. And that is, it still has the mobility, it still has the executes, it still has the easy plug and play availability for you to have for any type of content that you're interested in. But it does lose points because it is much more dependent on the immediate area in front of you. And it does require you to use buff foods that are pretty expensive. So I've been experimenting with Stamsorks for a while now, and I have been using, a lot of buff foods that require perfect row, which in this economy almost makes me want to drop this down to a D tier. Anything that requires you to use buff food that costs perfect row, but I'm kidding. It is still a great class overall, and I can highly encourage you guys to utilize it if you're interested in something that's a little bit more flavorful for a stamina class, but is a little bit more complex. I definitely think that Stamsorks definitely shine more right now in solo PvP than definitely PvE, but that's also not necessarily something that you will normally say is not true. Generally, stamina classes do better for PvP, while Magicka classes do better for PvE, because you have a lot more versatility. You can avoid more mechanics by being at different ranges. It could just be a little bit more simplistic based on the type of content that you're doing. But that's kind of the solo mantra. It's just going to depend on what you want to do. For example, some of you guys might just look at this list and think, well, the only thing I'm going to be doing is questing. And I think that's what drives a lot of endgame players crazy when we talk about tier lists, is because we're trying to capture what everybody could potentially want to do. There's plenty of ESO players who will never do a trial, a dungeon, a battleground. They'll never go to Cyrodiil, never go to the Imperial City. They're just going to do every single zone story quest in a row. Then you've got players who do 0 quests. They don't do any of them. They go straight into Cyrodiil, PvP, arenas, dungeons, trials, and then they level up, in the overworld, doing, things like Skyreach, and then they get all of their skill points from doing public dungeons, so they never have to do a quest. So everyone is so different. And that's why these tier lists can be hard, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below, because I am definitely curious to hear what you guys think. But dear friends, this is the tier list. What did you think? Where did you disagree with me? Let me know. And we are still doing our 3 giveaway drawings. All you have to do to enter is by leaving a like on the video, be subscribed, and then listen for a random word be flashed upon the screen. If you were the first person to comment that word, you will win. So thank you guys so much again, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye, guys.
Better remember to like and subscribe to Jake Clips. Or you should. I might have to pluck your eyes if you don't. Or, better yet, I'll skip rope with your entrails. Do it now. Subscribe. Ta-ta. Off with you.
Sorry for the lack of the video yesterday. I blame my video editor. She kept falling asleep on my leg, and that was causing me to just also fall asleep because I'd be too guilty to wake up. She's actually over there eating. Sometimes when I'm about to record videos, I'll give her food. That way she is distracted during recording, especially during longer videos, because one time, actually the last time we made a tier list video, she unplugged the microphone about 90% of the way, when we had started, and so 90% of the video had no audio. I was just recording to nobody. No, there was no microphone plugged in, so it would have just been me mouthing the video. So We'll do a treasure map video either tomorrow or Tuesday. That's kind of next on the old radar, but if you have suggestions, put them in the comments below. I'll catch you later. Peace.